He left his card on the pharmacy counter that morning and never once looked back, too focused on the meeting that was about to decide the fate of his company. An hour later, the machine beeped, and the word on the screen made his stomach drop. Declined. He stared at it, certain there had to be a mistake, because men like him did not get turned away over $4. Before you settle in, this is Winter Vale, and if stories about kindness finding its way home mean something to you, hit that subscribe button and stay until the very last scene, because this one earns it. I promise you it gets better than you think. I have always believed winter has a way of stripping people down to what they really are. The cold makes you either colder or kinder, and there is rarely an in-between. This story is about a man who thought he had lost everything the moment his card was declined, and a woman who taught him that the best things in life are never really lost, only waiting for snow to clear so you can see them again. The cashier at the little coffee shop on Larimer Street offered an apologetic smile, the kind she probably gave a dozen times a shift. "Sir, I'm sorry, your card was declined." Weston Hale blinked at her, certain there had been some mix-up at the terminal, and asked her to run it again. The second beep was just as final as the first, and this time a few people in line behind him began to shift on their feet. "I don't understand," he said quietly, checking his coat pockets as though a different card might materialize out of nowhere. He had exactly one card on him, an old one that had expired months earlier and that he kept out of habit rather than use, tucked behind the one that actually mattered. That card, the one that worked, was sitting on a pharmacy counter 3 miles away, forgotten in the rush of a morning that had already gone sideways twice. A woman 2 people back in line stepped forward before the cashier could even suggest he step aside. She set her own card on the counter without hesitation and told the cashier to put his coffee on hers. "It's only $4, she said, offering him a small, easy smile, like it genuinely cost her nothing to say it. He was 34 years old, the founder of an investment firm that had grown from a single rented office into a company worth well over $1 billion, and he was not used to strangers doing anything for him without wanting something in return. "You don't know me," Weston said, half laughing at the strangeness of the moment. The woman shrugged, gathering her bag over one shoulder. "I don't need to," she said. "Sometimes you just help." Then she turned and walked toward a table by the window before he could even get her name. Snowflakes drifting past the glass behind her like the morning had decided to slow down just for that. 1 hour earlier, Weston Hale had exactly 9 minutes to get across town for the most important board meeting of the year, the one where 3 investors were deciding whether to back the expansion of Hale Ventures or quietly walk away from it. His driver, Desmond, was already idling outside, and his assistant Naomi had called twice in the last 5 minutes alone. Every second mattered that morning, or at least it was supposed to. Instead, his attention snagged on an elderly woman standing at the pharmacy counter, her hands trembling slightly as she counted a thin stack of crumpled bills and a handful of loose change. The pharmacist behind the counter offered her a gentle, practiced sympathy. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're still $6 short on the copay." The woman lowered her eyes and said she would come back once she had enough, already reaching to slide the little white bag back across the counter. Weston stepped forward before he had fully decided to. "Please don't put it away," he said, and both women turned to look at him at once. He set his card down on the counter and told the pharmacist to put the whole thing on him, and to add anything else she might need for the week while she was at it. The pharmacist blinked at him, asking if he was certain, and Weston nodded without a second of hesitation. The woman, whose name turned out to be Loretta Finnegan, pressed a trembling hand to her chest and told him she couldn't possibly let him do that. Weston smiled at her gently and told her she wasn't asking, he was offering, and that was different. Before she could argue further, his phone buzzed against his palm, Naomi's name flashing across the screen for the 3rd time that morning, and he apologized and hurried for the door. He never noticed his card still sitting where the pharmacist had left it, tucked beside the register under a little dish of peppermints. Outside, the snow had started to fall in earnest, fat, unhurried flakes that clung to the windshield of his car the second Desmond pulled away from the curb. Weston barely registered it, his mind already 3 miles ahead in a boardroom full of men who did not care how many people he had helped that year. By the time he stepped into the conference room at Hale Ventures, every seat at the long table was filled, a dozen faces turning toward him with a mixture of impatience and relief. Naomi slid a folder in front of him without a word, the corner of it already dog-eared from how many times she had opened it that morning to check the numbers one last time. Weston sat, gave a short nod, and told the room to begin. For nearly 2 hours, the conversation circled the same fight from every angle. One investor, a sharp-eyed man named Bruce Calder, argued they should slash funding to Hale Ventures' community lending arm to boost quarterly margins before the expansion vote. Another wanted to delay the whole initiative until spring, worried that a winter rollout would look reckless to the press. The room grew louder with every round. Weston let them talk themselves out before he finally leaned forward. If turning a better profit means abandoning the small business owners this company was built to help, he said evenly, then we are chasing the wrong kind of growth entirely. The room went quiet in a way it rarely did around Bruce Calder, and after a long pause, the vote came back nearly unanimous in Weston's favor, all but one hand. Calder did not clap when the vote closed, though everyone else did, and Weston noticed it the way you notice a single dark cloud on an otherwise clear day. As the room emptied, one of the younger board members clapped him on the shoulder and said he didn't know how Weston made the hardest calls look so simple. They're never simple, Weston told him, just necessary, and he meant every word of it. Desmond had the car running by the time Weston came down, snow already gathering along the curb in a thin, undisturbed layer. Back to the office, sir, Desmond asked, and Weston shook his head, telling him he needed coffee first and somewhere quiet. Desmond pulled away from downtown without another word, weaving toward the smaller streets where the snowplows hadn't yet come through. Neither of them thought once about the card still sitting behind a pharmacy register 3 miles behind, tucked beside a dish of peppermints and a stack of coupon flyers. The little coffee shop Desmond found was called the Snowdrift, tucked between a shuttered bakery and a bookstore with fogged-up windows, exactly the kind of place Weston liked when he wanted to disappear from his own name for 20 minutes. He told Desmond he'd call when he was ready and stepped inside alone. The bell over the door gave a soft, tinny chime as he walked in, and the warmth of the little shop hit him all at once, a welcome contrast to the cold biting at his ears outside. He took a stool at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and let out a slow breath, the first one all morning that didn't feel rushed. For a few seconds, at least, the board meeting felt like it belonged to someone else's life. That was when the cashier ran his card and the machine beeped its flat, unmistakable rejection, the same scene that had opened this story, circling back around to meet itself. Weston frowned at the little screen, certain it had to be some fluke of the terminal, but the second attempt came back exactly the same. He checked his wallet and realized with a quiet, embarrassed laugh that the card he'd handed over was the expired one he never used. His actual card, the one that worked, was still sitting on a counter across town, and for a moment the reality of it landed on him fully. The cashier, sensing his growing discomfort, offered to try again, gentler this time, though the outcome didn't change. "I'm sorry," she said. "Do you have another card?" Weston shook his head, admitting quietly that he did not, and the little shop fell into an awkward hush around him. That was the moment the woman 2 people back in line stepped forward and set her card down without a second thought, the scene the story had already shown once from the outside. Only now, from the inside, Weston noticed the details he'd missed before, the gentle color in her cheeks from the cold outside, the stack of graded papers tucked under one arm, the softness in her eyes when she told him it was only $4. She walked to a table by the window before he could even ask her name. Weston stood there a moment, coffee in hand, watching her settle into the booth and pull a red pen from her bag. Something about the ease of what she'd done kept him rooted to the spot longer than made sense for a stranger buying him breakfast. He picked up the coffee she had just paid for and crossed the little shop toward her table, stopping beside the empty chair across from her. "May I?" he asked, and she looked up from the stack of spelling tests scattered in front of her, a small, teasing smile pulling at her mouth. "That depends," she said, setting her pen down. "On what?" he asked, sitting anyway before she'd fully answered. "Are you about to spend the next 10 minutes trying to pay me back?" she asked, arching an eyebrow, and Weston laughed, shaking his head. "No," he told her. "I was actually hoping you'd answer one question first." "I'm listening," she said, folding the last of her papers into a neat stack. "Why did you help me?" he asked. "You didn't know who I was, or whether I even deserved it." She shrugged, telling him she knew enough. that he'd looked embarrassed and had been trying very hard not to let anyone notice, and that she had seen that particular look plenty of times before. "You have?" he asked, and she nodded, explaining she taught second grade, and that children wore brave faces all the time, pretending they were fine when they weren't. Her name, she told him, was Piper Donovan, and she'd been teaching at Larch Elementary for 6 years now. Weston introduced himself in turn, and the ease with which she said his name back, without a trace of the recognition or calculation he usually got from strangers, loosened a knot in his shoulders he hadn't realized was there. For the next 20 minutes they talked about nothing important at all, the snow outside thickening steadily against the window glass. He told her, eventually, about the woman at the pharmacy and the card he'd left behind in his hurry to help her. Piper laughed at that, a real laugh, saying that explained the look on his face when his card was declined here too. Weston admitted he'd been more nervous walking over to her table than he had been in any boardroom that year, and she told him that was a good sign, that it meant he was being honest. Over the following 2 weeks, the snowdrift quietly folded itself into Weston's routine, though he never quite admitted that to himself out loud. Some afternoons they talked for 20 minutes, some for a full hour, and neither of them seemed to notice how naturally those conversations had become the best part of the week. Piper told him about her classroom, about the boy who dreamed of becoming an astronaut despite never having left their small stretch of Colorado, and Weston found himself listening far more than he spoke. One Tuesday morning, while Piper was straightening books along a shelf in her classroom, her principal, Mr. Castellano, appeared at the door with an unusually excited look on his face. "There you are," he said. "We have a very special visitor coming by this afternoon." Piper asked who it was, and Castellano told her it was the businessman who had been quietly funding the school's lunch program and covering supply costs for a dozen struggling families for the better part of 2 years. "The anonymous donor?" Piper asked, and Castellano nodded, explaining the man had always insisted on staying out of the spotlight, but had finally agreed to visit the children in person. "He wants every teacher in the assembly hall right after lunch," Castellano said. "Don't be late." The whole school buzzed with excitement through the morning. Kids practicing welcome songs and teachers pinning handmade banners to the walls of the gymnasium. Piper stood near the back with the other teachers that afternoon, smiling as her students whispered excitedly among themselves. When Castellano finally stepped onto the little stage and announced the man's name, Piper's stomach dropped in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Please join me in welcoming Mr. Weston Hale," Castellano said, and Piper watched, stunned, as the man from the coffee shop walked out to warm applause, his eyes finding hers almost instantly across the crowded room. After the applause faded, Weston made his way down from the stage to greet the teachers individually, stopping in front of Piper last of all. She leaned in slightly, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear it. "So you're the mystery donor, and apparently a billionaire," she said, and he answered with something close to a sheepish smile, admitting that he was. "I was hoping you'd get to know me first," he told her, and she studied him a moment before smiling back, telling him she was glad she had. For the rest of the afternoon, Piper watched Weston sit cross-legged on the classroom floor with her students, answering their questions and laughing along with them, as though there were nowhere else in the world he needed to be. It wasn't his money that impressed her, not really. It was the way he treated every single one of those children as though they mattered exactly as much as anyone in his boardroom. Watching him, she understood a little better why helping a stranger over a cup of coffee had come so easily to him. Snow had started falling again by the time the visit wrapped up, drifting past the tall classroom windows in slow, lazy spirals that made the whole afternoon feel softer somehow. Weston lingered after most of the parents and staff had cleared out, wandering the hallway to look at the artwork pinned along the walls. Piper eventually caught up to him there, asking if he made a habit of visiting schools this often. "I don't," he admitted. "I enjoy visiting this one." "What made you start doing this in the first place?" she asked, and Weston went quiet for a moment before answering. He told her about a teacher from his own childhood, one who had refused to let him give up on himself back when his father was too consumed by building a company to notice him, and his mother had passed when he was young. "I never forgot her," he said, "so when I finally had the means, I promised myself I'd give other kids the chances I'd had." Just then a little boy named Dexter ran up to Piper, tugging at her sleeve, complaining that his shoe had come apart again at the sole. Piper knelt without a moment's hesitation, examining the damage and telling him gently that they would figure it out together, that he had nothing to be sorry for. Weston watched the entire exchange in silence. Something about the boy's embarrassed little apology sticking with him long after he'd climbed back into the car that evening. The next morning, before the first bell had even rung, a stack of neatly wrapped boxes arrived at Castellano's office. Brand new winter boots in every size for any child who might need a pair. There was no note attached beyond a single small card that read simply, "Every child deserves to walk to school without feeling the cold." Castellano didn't need to ask who had sent them, and neither did Piper when she heard about it later that day. A few days after the boots arrived, Piper found a small envelope waiting on her desk after the last bell rang. Inside was a handwritten note asking if she'd have dinner with him. No business, no cameras, just two people getting to know each other properly. She smiled to herself reading it, tucking the note into her coat pocket before heading out into the early winter dark to catch her bus home. That evening, instead of taking her to one of the city's expensive restaurants, Weston drove them out past the edge of town to a quiet overlook above a frozen reservoir, where a simple picnic had already been set up beneath a stand of bare cottonwood trees. Piper laughed when she saw it, telling him she'd expected private chefs and rooftop views from a man in his position. "I've learned the best conversations don't need expensive places," he told her, and he was surprised by how completely he meant it. They talked for hours as the sun dropped behind the mountains, the cold settling in around them in a way that felt almost comforting rather than harsh. Piper told him stories from her classroom, and Weston found himself sharing memories of building his company from nothing, the sleepless nights, and the countless setbacks nobody outside the boardroom ever heard about. Neither of them mentioned profits or quarterly targets or anything at all that belonged to the world waiting for them back in the city. When the stars finally came out, they walked slowly along the edge of the frozen water, in no hurry for the evening to end. "Can I tell you something?" Weston asked eventually, and Piper nodded, telling him of course. "The morning we met, I thought I'd simply lost my bank card," he said, "but I realize now I found something worth a great deal more than that." Piper smiled, asking what that was, and he told her it was proof that kindness still existed, that people still helped strangers without expecting a single thing in return. "I almost didn't pay for your coffee that morning," Piper admitted quietly, surprising him. "I'd had a difficult week, and for a second I told myself someone else would step up instead. Then I remembered something my father used to tell me, that if you ever get the chance to be someone's answer, you don't walk away from it." Weston looked at her for a long moment before telling her he was very glad she'd listened to her father, and Piper reached over and took his hand without hesitation. Neither of them said the word out loud that night, though something between them had shifted quietly and completely somewhere along that frozen shoreline. Winter has a way of doing that, stripping away the noise until only the truth of a thing is left standing in the cold. For Weston, that truth had a name now, and it wasn't the one printed on the door of his office downtown. It was Bruce Calder who noticed first, the same board member who had voted against the expansion weeks earlier, now sitting across a conference table with a folder of photographs spread in front of him. A photographer hired to cover the school visit for the company newsletter had captured more than intended, a candid frame of Weston leaning close to whisper something to Piper by the classroom door. Calder had been quietly collecting more scents, waiting for the right moment to use them. He called an emergency session of the board on a Thursday morning, snow falling heavily enough outside that half the investors arrived late, stamping the slush off their shoes in the lobby before filing into the room. Calder stood at the head of the table without waiting for Weston to settle into his chair, sliding the folder across the polished wood. "We need to discuss a serious conflict of interest," he said, before anyone had even taken off their coats. The photographs showed Weston and Piper at the overlook, at the diner, at the school, moments that had felt entirely private now laid bare under fluorescent boardroom lighting. Calder argued that a public relationship with a schoolteacher, however well-intentioned, exposed Hale Ventures to reputational risk right as they were preparing to court new institutional investors for the spring expansion. "This is not personal," Calder said flatly. "This is fiduciary responsibility." Calder leaned back in his chair with the calm of a man who already believed he'd won. "Off the record, Weston," he said, "this could go away quietly if you simply step back from her until the expansion closes. Nobody has to know anything changed. and in 6 months this whole folder disappears into a drawer somewhere. Weston looked at him for a long moment, disgusted less by the threat itself than by how easily Calder assumed he'd take it. Weston kept his voice level despite the anger tightening in his chest. Every dollar this company has ever made was built on the idea that people matter more than optics, he said, and if this board can't understand that, then perhaps the board is the one with a conflict of interest. The room went silent, though this time it wasn't the silence of agreement, and Calder's expression hardened into something closer to satisfaction than defeat. Calder proposed a vote of no confidence to remove Weston as managing partner until, in his words, matters of personal judgment could be clarified. Two board members who had backed Weston solidly for years suddenly looked uncertain, glancing between the photographs and the man they'd trusted with the company's future. The vote was scheduled for the following week, giving Calder just enough time to leak selective details to a local business journal before then. Naomi caught him in the hallway outside his office that same afternoon, her voice lower than usual, warning him that two of the investors expected to back the spring expansion had already asked their lawyers about the photographs. If Calder pushes this to a public fight, she told him, we could lose the funding round entirely, not just your seat on the board. Weston thanked her for the warning and told her he understood exactly what was at risk and that he still didn't intend to let a folder of photographs decide who he was allowed to care about. By Friday morning, a headline had appeared online questioning whether Hale Ventures' founder was, in the reporter's words, distracted by a personal entanglement during a critical growth period for the firm. Piper saw it before Weston had the chance to warn her, the article sitting open on her phone screen during her lunch break at school. She read it twice, her stomach sinking with each sentence, before setting the phone face down on her desk. In the teacher's lounge that same afternoon, a colleague named Ms. Alvarez set a cup of tea in front of Piper without being asked, sliding into the seat across from her. You look like someone who hasn't slept, Ms. Alvarez said gently, and Piper admitted she didn't know if she was helping Weston or ruining him. Ms. Alvarez studied her for a moment before saying that in 6 years of teaching together, she had never once seen Piper light up over anyone the way she had these past few weeks, article or no article. That evening, Weston came to find her at the snowdrift, snow falling steadily past the fogged front windows the way it had the very first morning they'd met. Piper was quieter than usual, her red pen sitting untouched beside a stack of ungraded tests. I saw the article, she said before he could say anything at all, and I think maybe I've made things harder for you than easier. Weston sat across from her, his voice steady even though his jaw had tightened. You haven't made anything harder, he told her. This is a board using an excuse they were already looking for. Piper shook her head slowly, telling him she didn't want to be the reason he lost the company he'd spent over a decade building from nothing, and that maybe it would be simpler for both of them if they stepped back until the vote had passed. For a moment Weston said nothing, watching the snow gather in soft drifts along the windowsill behind her, the same window that had framed her the very first time she'd offered to pay for his coffee. He thought about how easily she had helped a stranger that morning without a single condition attached, and how unfair it felt that the world now wanted to punish her for it. I'm not asking you to disappear so a room full of men can feel comfortable, he finally said, but I understand if you need time. Later that night, alone in her small kitchen with the article still open on her phone, Piper found herself staring at a photograph of herself she barely recognized, cropped and captioned by a reporter who had never once spoken to her. She thought about her students, about whether any of this would follow them into their own classroom gossip come Monday morning, and about whether loving someone was supposed to feel this complicated this quickly. She didn't have an answer by the time she finally turned off the light, only a tired, aching certainty that she didn't want to be the reason Weston lost everything he'd built. Piper didn't answer that night, only reached across the table and squeezed his hand once before gathering her things and stepping out into the cold alone, leaving Weston sitting with a coffee he no longer wanted. He walked out a few minutes later into the same falling snow, the streets around the snowdrift nearly silent, and it struck him, standing there alone, that he might lose both the company and the woman who had reminded him what mattered in the first place. Over the days that followed, Weston barely saw her, their easy afternoons replaced by short, careful text messages neither of them quite knew how to fill. He spent his hours instead building a case for the board, gathering every number the community lending program had produced over the years, every family it had kept afloat, every dollar that circled back into neighborhoods most investors never bothered to drive through. If Calder wanted a fight about values, Weston intended to bring the receipts. The night before the vote, Weston sat alone in his office long after Naomi had gone home, snow piling steadily against the tall windows overlooking downtown Denver. He thought about the woman at the pharmacy who could barely afford her medication, about Dexter's torn shoe, about Piper's hand slipping into his beside a frozen reservoir. And he understood, finally, exactly what he wanted to say to the board in the morning, whether or not it cost him the company entirely. The boardroom was colder than usual the next day, both in temperature and mood, every seat filled well before the scheduled hour. Calder stood first, laying out his argument again for the newer members who hadn't heard it directly, framing Weston's relationship with Piper as reckless, unprofessional, a liability the firm could not afford heading into a delicate expansion. He finished by calling for an immediate vote to remove Weston pending, in his words, a full review of his judgment. Weston stood without raising his voice, sliding a thick folder across the table just as Calder had done to him days earlier. Before you vote, he said, I'd like you to look at what this company actually does when nobody outside this room is watching. The folder held 5 years of data on the lending program Calder wanted gutted, family businesses saved, jobs kept through hard winters, communities that had trusted Hale Ventures specifically because it behaved differently than every firm before it. Then he told them, plainly, about the morning 3 weeks earlier, an elderly woman short on her medication, a card left behind at a pharmacy counter, and a schoolteacher who paid for a stranger's coffee without knowing or caring who he was. That is the company I built, he said, and if this board believes kindness is a liability rather than the entire foundation of our business model, then perhaps I am no longer the right fit for this room, not the other way around. He closed the folder and looked around the table at faces that had trusted him with their money for years, some of them since the very first winter he'd opened his doors with nothing but a small office and a handful of stubborn convictions. I didn't build this firm to make the safest decisions in the room, he told them. I built it to make the right ones, even when they cost me something. And if this board can no longer tell the difference between those two things, then we have a much bigger problem than a photograph of me having coffee with someone I care about. A long silence followed, broken finally by the oldest member of the board, a quiet woman named Harriet who rarely spoke in these meetings at all. I've sat on this board since Weston's second year in business, she said, looking directly at Calder, and I have never once seen our numbers look better than they do right now. Calder shot back that numbers didn't erase a conflict of interest, and Harriet asked him, evenly, whether he had ever once, in all his years here, found a single dollar of fraud, mismanagement, or self-dealing in Weston's ledgers. Calder didn't answer. Then you have nothing, she said, only a photograph you don't like. The vote, when it finally came, went overwhelmingly in Weston's favor, Calder's hand the only one raised against him. Calder resigned from the board within the week, quietly, without any of the fanfare his photographs had tried to create, and the story that eventually reached the local paper looked nothing like the one he'd hoped to leak. Instead, it told the story of a company that had quietly funded a school's lunch program for years, and of the schoolteacher whose small act of kindness had somehow found its way back to her tenfold. Piper read that version twice as well, this time with a small, disbelieving smile instead of a sinking stomach. Weston found her at the snowdrift again that evening, snow falling outside the window in the same slow, unhurried way it always seemed to whenever they were together. He told her everything. The vote, Calder's resignation, the folder full of numbers that had somehow mattered more than a handful of photographs. Piper listened quietly, her red pen forgotten beside a stack of papers she never got around to grading that night. I was afraid I'd cost you everything, she admitted, and Weston shook his head, telling her she'd given him something worth more than the company ever could, a reminder of exactly why he'd built it in the first place. He reached across the table for her hand, the same table where a $4 cup of coffee had somehow rearranged the entire shape of his life. I don't want to spend the rest of this winter wondering if you're too afraid to be seen with me, he told her. I'd rather spend it making sure you never have to wonder about me at all. Piper laughed softly, wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater, telling him that sounded like the kind of thing men said in movies right before something went wrong. Maybe, he said, or maybe it's the kind of thing men say when they've finally figured out what they actually want. She studied him a long moment, snow drifting steadily past the window behind him, before finally admitting she wanted exactly the same thing. Several weeks later, the gymnasium at Larch Elementary filled with laughter for an entirely different reason. Parents and teachers and children gathered to celebrate the opening of a new winter clothing drive funded quietly through the Hale Ventures community program. There were no banners with Weston's name on them, no speeches praising his generosity, only children excited about new coats and boots stacked neatly along the back wall. Piper stood beside him as the ribbon was cut, watching the same kids who'd once teased Dexter about his broken shoe now trying on boots 2 sizes too big just for fun. Dexter himself marched straight up to Weston in a pair of bright red winter boots, announcing proudly that he hadn't tripped once all morning, and Weston knelt right there on the gymnasium floor to tell him that was the best news he'd heard all week. Near the back of the gymnasium, an older woman in a heavy wool coat waited patiently for the crowd to thin before making her way toward them, and it took Weston a moment to place her without the counter and the prescription bag between them. Loretta Finnegan smiled up at him, telling him she'd read about everything in the paper and simply had to come see for herself the kind of man who'd once refused to let her walk away without her medicine. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength for someone her age, telling him that kindness always circled back eventually, and that she was glad she'd lived long enough to watch it circle back to him. "You've changed so many lives here," Piper told him quietly, and Weston shook his head, telling her they'd changed his first. "If I hadn't forgotten that card at the pharmacy," he said, "I never would have walked into your coffee shop that morning. If I hadn't walked in, I never would have met the woman who reminded me what any of this was actually for." Piper laughed, reminding him she'd only bought him a $4 coffee, and Weston told her that coffee had turned out to be the best investment he'd ever made. That evening, after the gymnasium had emptied and the last of the snow had been swept from the entryway, Weston walked Piper out to the parking lot beneath a sky finally clear of clouds after weeks of gray. He stopped walking halfway across the lot and went quiet for a moment, long enough that Piper turned back to ask if something was wrong. He admitted, a little sheepishly, that he'd rehearsed this moment 3 separate times in the car and had already forgotten every word of it the second she'd smiled at him by the door. Piper laughed, telling him he'd negotiated board members out of firing him just that week, and he could certainly manage this, and her steady patience was somehow enough to loosen whatever had caught in his throat. He stopped beneath the one working street lamp at the edge of the lot, snow still piled in soft drifts along the curb despite the clearing sky above them. "I've built companies," he told her. "I've closed deals worth more money than I know what to do with, but none of it ever meant as much as what we found together over a cup of coffee." He took both her hands in his voice steady despite the cold biting at both of them. "I want to spend the rest of my winters making sure no child in your classroom ever goes without a coat, and no morning ever starts without you in it," he said. Piper's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the cold, and she told him, through a smile, that she would like that very much, slipping her hand into his without a moment's hesitation. Somewhere behind them, through the gymnasium's fogged windows, Ms. Alvarez and a few of the other teachers watched the whole thing unfold with their coats already halfway zipped, none of them bothering to look away. No rings appeared that night, no elaborate speech beyond the one he'd already given. Just 2 people who had discovered that the best love stories rarely start with anything grand at all. Sometimes they start with a declined card and a stranger who decides, for no reason beyond her own good heart, that a $4 breakfast is worth paying for. As they walked back toward the car together, snow began falling once more, soft and slow, settling over the parking lot like the whole world had decided to exhale. "Before you go, I want to ask you something. Do you believe one small act of kindness can genuinely change the course of somebody's life, the way it changed Weston's that winter morning? If you were in Piper's shoes, standing in that line with a stranger's card declined in front of you, would you have stepped forward the way she did? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I would love to know what you would have done. If this story warmed something in you tonight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Winter Veil, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. Share it with someone who still believes in this kind of quiet, unglamorous kindness, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return. Thank you for spending this time with me. and I will see you in the next one.